Now the syntax is actually really easy to write. All we do is we declare the const that we want to dynamically import and wrap it in lazy. So we'll say that our new homepage component is equal to lazy, which is a function that gets passed a function that calls import and then the string to the path that we want. So for us, it will be this homepage component. And now, if we remove this, our homepage is now lazy loaded in, meaning that when the application mounts for the first time, it will get this chunk that represents everything except for the homepage. The moment, though, that the homepage needs to be actually rendered because React Router sees, oh, you're on this path, this root path, I need to render this component, the homepage will then be pulled from the backend and lazy loaded into this route. So this is actually really cool because we're using React Router. We get this route level lazy loading right out the jump with React Lazy and React Router. Now, the problem with this, however, is because this is asynchronous, this homepage has an opportunity where it might not exist, and it depends on how fast our server is. Because if our server is slow, you can see that when we request for our homepage from our backend server, it might take some time and the user will see nothing. In fact, there might actually be an error. So what we want to do is we want to leverage React Suspense. Now, I'm not going to use it yet, and what we're going to see what happens is you'll see that there's this error right here. Because there's something unknown that our React context is trying to build from the route. And right now, homepage is undefined because it's not loaded yet. That's why we need to wrap it in suspense. And what suspense is a new component that React has released that allows you to wrap any part of your application that might be rendering asynchronous components. So lazy loading components. It's actually meant to be used with React Lazy. So now if I wrap suspense around our routes, suspense is a component that must take a fallback property. And the fallback property points to any HTML element or component itself. So because it can render any component, I'm just going to manually write one for now called div. And what this div inside is just going to say loading. So now if I save this and we go back to our application, we'll see that there was a split second where you saw the loading text. Well, that's what suspense is doing. Suspense just renders our fallback div and waits until the actual component is finished being lazy loaded, dynamically imported, and then it will automatically switch to the right component for us. So this is pretty much all React Lazy is. It's a really simple way for us to get this lazy load. And now, in fact, if we were to look at the console, let me just make sure that I'm plopping this out. If we look at the network, we actually will see that we have broken our chunk into two. So there's our initial bundle, and this, again, is all the libraries. There's that main chunk we were looking at before. And this is zero chunk. Zero chunk is the first chunk of our homepage. So we see that we've actually broken our application into two chunks instead of the one main chunk that we were getting before. So this is really great for us because now we can see that we've properly chunked up and code split our application. And that's really all there is to it. You just use suspense and you use this React Lazy to import the homepage. Now, we can actually convert all of our other components over to this lazy style. And it literally just is going to follow the exact same format. So we can do it for all these other ones as well. We'll just do const shop page equals lazy. And lazy just takes a dynamic import of the string of our shop page. Let's just make sure to do this for all of our other components, like our sign in and sign up page, and then our checkout page. And now if we also convert this one over, as well as our checkout page, we can remove these other imports that we had before. Now, The great thing as well about Suspense is that Suspense can actually encapsulate multiple components, and it will wait and render this fallback until every single component inside has finished lazy loading. So if I were to do this and move our Suspense to wrap all of our new lazy loaded routes, right, that are pointing to our lazy loaded components. Let me also just fix this import string here. That's an extra period. But now that we have all of our lazy loaded routes, if we go back to our application and I reopen my network tab and I do a hard refresh, we'll see we have our main chunks. But also, now if we go to our shop page, we'll notice that we're actually also getting in new chunks, this 4 chunk. All right, let's go to a sign-in page. There is the 6 chunk. And if I go to checkout, there's some more chunks. So React is now properly chunking all of those pages that we set up as their own dynamic imports. So we're lazy loaded into these components now. So this is pretty much going to make our performance a little bit faster because our route is now being broken up into smaller and smaller chunks that only get downloaded when they need to be. I will say that one big thing is that because our code is not extremely heavy, you're not going to see massive results. You're not going to see us go from, say, like hundreds of kilobytes down to tens of kilobytes, because our application is just not that large to begin with. But on larger applications, you'll definitely feel these improvements, and it's so easy to write, it makes no sense for us not to do so. So with that, we now have a much more applicable chunking system for code splitting our application by simply just using Suspense and React Lazy. Now, instead of rendering this loading div, let's say I want to render a component that we're familiar with. Let's actually render our spinner component. What we have to do is move the spinner into its own component because it's currently sitting inside of our with spinner higher order component. So what we'll do is we will make a new folder called spinner. And inside will be both our spinner.styles.js as well as our spinner.component.jsx. So what I want to do is I want to move all of these spinner styles into my new spinner component here. And then I'm going to import them the way that I did before inside of that component. Oops, this is from React. And these are from the spinner styles. And all our spinner component is going to be is just a presentational component that shows our spinner overlay with our spinner container inside of it. So this is pretty much all we were rendering inside of our with spinner component. So now instead of rendering this, what I want to render is my new spinner component. Because we're going to use this spinner component inside of our code. Now, because this const is now conflicting, we see that all we're doing from this function is simply just returning this function. So instead, what we can do is we can just set this up as a default return, and our component should still work the same. But now what we have access to is that new spinner component. So let's delete this with spinner styles because we've moved that code into its own spinner component. And now we can just simply import that into our app code. Let's just import that right here. Spinner component. And let's just render our new spinner component. So now, when our app loads, we see that there's our spinner. So it looks way closer and way better. So that's what's really great about Suspense and React Lazy, is that we can literally render any placeholder component that we want. So with that, we have our routes on our main app split into lazy loaded components. The only other place where I believe we have other routes is our shop page. Our shop page actually holds two routes in themselves as well, which is the collections overview container and the collection page container. So as an exercise, I want you to practice what we did using Suspense and React Lazy and turn these into lazy loaded components and render them in the routes. So after you've done that, I'll meet you in the next lesson where we'll talk about further optimizing our components.